From the Gulf States newsroom, this is the Gulf States Gumbo, your weekly serving of stories from Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana. I'm public health reporter Drew Hawkins, chopping it up this week. On today's show, local communities are using nature to solve man-made problems, like the street flooding in New Orleans Treme neighborhood. Residents are appealing to elected officials for help.
It's very traumatic. It brings on anxiety. It brings on not being in control.
Now, residents are trying to find out the causes of urban flooding and how to address them. And in Mississippi, tribal nations are using forests to tackle greenhouse gases and getting paid to do it. That's all coming up on the Gulf States Gumbo. Street flooding has long plagued people living in the Treme neighborhood in New Orleans. Our environment and communities reporter Danny McArthur reports on how some residents are figuring out the root causes of urban flooding and trying to address them.
So we're on Robinson Street, and it floods here a lot.
Cheryl Austin shows me around the Treme neighborhood in New Orleans, Louisiana. She points out one of the planter boxes they installed to help collect rainwater. Often, these planter boxes have paintings of important figures in the neighborhood, like the late Jim Hayes, a community activist. As we walk around, Austin tells me about the Treme she grew up knowing and loving.
Treme, in my opinion, is the cultural mecca of New Orleans, only second to the French Quarters.
She says it was a fun place to grow up because there was always something going on, in a bar, church, or funeral parlor on almost every corner of this community.
So I like to say we always knew where our parents was. They was in either one of those places, either praying, partying, or no longer here.
Austin still lives in the neighborhood. She's also the executive director of the Greater Treme Consortium, a nonprofit focused on community development. One major problem they're addressing is urban flooding. It happens when rainfall overwhelms the stormwater drainage capacity of a densely populated area.
It's very traumatic. It brings on anxiety. It brings on not being in control.
After a series of flooding events from late 2023 to early 2024, residents decided to go to their local city council to ask them to look into what was going on in the neighborhood. They've also sent information to the Department of Justice asking them to investigate the area. In the meantime, Treme residents are getting creative with how to address urban flooding themselves. Austin shows me the rain garden outside of her office.
We have all native plants over on this side. And they're a little brown because of the freeze that we just went through.
Rain gardens are designed to capture runoff from hard surfaces, like a sidewalk or a driveway. The water is then filtered into the soil, rather than running off to the street. That's one form of water management known as green infrastructure. Austin says they have the rain garden to help people understand what can be done to detain water.
And so we collect about 335 gallons of water here whenever it rains.
But while community groups are taking this work on, Austin says they need government help too.
What we have is a chronic flooding issue here that needs to be taken on by our elected officials and not just the community.
Megan Williams, the Urban Water Program Manager for the City of New Orleans, says she's seen this type of flooding become exacerbated in the last few decades. And she says there are a few reasons why.
We are a city that is surrounded by levees, so we're within a bowl.
New Orleans is a very rainy city that's seeing much more frequent and intense rainfall events in general. And it sits on swampy marshland, which is a clay material.
So if you can think about a piece of Play-Doh, it doesn't really absorb water very well. So what happens for us when it rains is all of that water kind of just sits on top of our soil, on top of grass, and it doesn't infiltrate at all.
New Orleans has a lot of pavement and hard surfaces that don't absorb water either. On top of that, it's an old city with old infrastructure. You can see the culmination of all of that in an area like Treme.
It is a historic Black neighborhood, so they sit near a lot of landmarks also, which make it a little bit more difficult to be innovative in some of the solutions that we may propose in those areas.
Right now, a big push for the city is green infrastructure as one of their flood mitigation strategies. But there are challenges. Williams says there isn't a lot of funding for this type of drainage infrastructure. And the city has had to get creative with how to get it.
I'll show you this one. This is the last one.
Cheryl Austin and I finish our tour looking at some final examples of green infrastructure. The consortium has partnered with groups like WaterWise Gulf South to implement more of it. Austin says they don't get funding from the city for their work.
The flooding has been taking place for years now. It's not their fault. It's not probably our utility company's fault. It's everybody's concern, and everybody should be a part of what needs to happen.
Meanwhile, the consortium and its partners hired an engineering firm to help them identify why flooding persists in some street corners. Austin says they should have more information by the end of May. For the Gulf States Newsroom, I'm Danny McArthur.
The Gulf States Newsroom is a team of journalists working with NPR and local public media stations in Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana to cover the issues that matter to you. Email us, connect@gulfstatesnewsroom.org.
You're listening to the Gulf States Gumbo. I'm Drew Hawkins. Protecting forests is important work. Some groups have been doing it for centuries. Now, one organization is working with tribal nations and indigenous people to try and get those communities paid for their stewardship, using what are known as carbon credits. And back to break this all down for us is our environment and communities reporter, Danny McArthur. Danny, thanks for being here.
Yeah, thanks for bringing me on. I'll do my best to make sense of everything.
Really appreciate it, Danny. First of all, what is carbon sequestration?
Yeah, so carbon sequestration is this idea that you can capture and store carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. The reason you want to do that is because carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas, meaning that's a significant contributor to climate change. Some groups think this is the future of offsetting emissions for big polluters, but others aren't so convinced the science is fully there yet.
Okay, that makes sense. And the idea also is you can make money off that, right? Can you explain what that is and how that happens, how it works?
Yeah, it's through something called carbon credits. So theoretically, carbon credits are a way for companies to offset the greenhouse gas emissions they create. So let's use the Mississippi Band of Choctaw Indians for an example. They're saying they're going to use a good chunk of their tribal lands to preserve their native forest. Now, trees naturally store or sequester carbon. They can then go to a business or individual and say, hey, we can sell you this many carbon credits to offset the greenhouse gas emissions you're creating. So basically, these businesses are paying for the stored carbon as a way to reach certain climate goals. So 1 carbon credit is equal to 1 ton of carbon dioxide. That's supposed to mean 1 fewer ton of carbon dioxide in the air.
All right. I wonder if you can talk a little bit more about this effort to help indigenous communities leverage their natural resources. Who's working on that? Who's involved in it?
Yeah, so it's called the National Indian Carbon Coalition. It's a tribally led, not-for-profit organization created by the Indian Land Tenure Foundation and the Intertribal Agriculture Council. Ryan Vasquez, the program director, put it this way.
And we focus on the protection and preservation of tribal natural resources rather than the extraction or exploitation of those natural resources. And so what we want to do is try to enroll tribal lands and tribal natural resources into different ecosystem marketplaces.
Okay, interesting. You mentioned earlier the Mississippi Band of Choctaw Indians. Can you talk a little bit about this project with them? What are they doing?
Yeah, so they're trying to increase carbon sequestration and forest health for over 25,000 acres of tribal lands. They're using their enrolled woodlands as conservation and a carbon sequestration forest. The Mississippi Band of Choctaw Indians then focuses on things like sustainable practices for the forest. So according to Van Stippen, this project started a few years back when one of the partner organizations contacted them to see if a carbon project would be feasible. And once they found out it was economically viable and the tribe decided it was going to be beneficial for their land and community, they started planning what the project would look like. So the thing with these projects is that it can take several months or even years to get off the ground. And one of the steps that they had to take was getting certified on a carbon registry. So something that Van Stippen pointed out is that the tribes are the ones who decide who to sell these credits to. And they're usually trying to find organizations that have the same kind of goals as the tribe. So it's unlikely they'd sell to like an oil or gas company or a pipeline operator, for example. Van Stippen says projects like this are a way for tribes to get money for their tribal resources.
Back in the day, the easiest way to derive revenue was cut down a tree or mine your land or allow pipelines to be transported and designed across tribal lands. And a lot of times that revenue was never really truly given back to the tribal community. So by entering into these newer marketplaces, tribes are able to dictate what type of control over those resources they have.
So we've been talking about, tribal nations, indigenous people getting paid for this, but how much money are we actually talking here? How much can they actually make, and what do they plan to use it for?
Stephen Taglieri, the marketing director for the National Indian Carbon Coalition, says they've generated over $3 million off removal credits and more than $1 million off of reduction credits.
Okay, correct me if I'm wrong here, but it sounds like everybody wins. The environment wins. Indigenous people are benefiting from both the environmental and economic impacts of this effort. What's the catch? Is it too good to be true?
Yeah, so unfortunately, it is not a magic solution. There is a lot of controversy around this idea of carbon capture. Some people say it's another form of greenwashing. And when someone says that, what they mean is that it's pretending to be more environmentally friendly than it actually is. And they say that it can be a distraction from real climate solutions. So one reason why people might say this is greenwashing is that some experts say there's no such thing as undoing emissions. Once it's in the atmosphere, the damage is done. And others say the only real answer to emissions is reducing them in the first place. And they say that things like this are just a way of putting off taking that kind of meaningful action. But even if there's some controversy around the science itself, what isn't controversial is the idea of preserving trees, whatever the motivation, is good for the planet's health overall. And the National Indian Carbon Coalition argues that projects like this can help ensure those preservation efforts are benefiting tribal nations by giving back to them instead of simply taking resources away.
That's Environment and Communities reporter Danny McArthur. Danny, thanks again for sitting down and explaining this all to us.
Thanks for having me.
Before you go, unfortunately, this is actually going to be your last Gulf States Gumbo because you're leaving us soon. And we're really happy for you, but we are definitely sad to see you go. We've gotten to work together on some really great collaborative projects. I'm thinking about the lemon tree mound story. We had a whole episode on that. I'm thinking about Place a Race, which we won a Murrow Award for. I guess what I would ask you is, what is a gem that comes to mind from your time working in the Gulf States newsroom?
I guess I hate to sound like I'm doing a cop-out, but honestly, just being in Mississippi has been like a gem for me. This is kind of where I started out my journalism career, and it's where I went from a little baby journalist to a more experienced journalist. I got to know all sorts of people. When I first started out, I was in Northeast Mississippi, and one of the first big things I was thrown on was Elvis Fest, which if you've never been to Elvis Fest, it is an experience. Lots of Elvis tribute artists all over the place. And then I fell very deeply into the world of farmers. That has continued here. Yeah, and just, the people, honestly, people always talk about Mississippi as if it has to be at the bottom, you always thank God for Mississippi kind of thing. But what I've learned is that, Mississippi is full of people who are very, very resilient, very determined, and it was an honor to be a journalist here.
Very well said, Danny. Thank you. It's been an honor working with you, and best of luck with everything else that you do, which I know is going to be really great. This week's show was hosted by me, Drew Hawkins, and is cooked up by the Gulf States Newsroom team. Our theme music is by DJ Supreme. Special thanks to our partner stations, WBHM, Mississippi Public Broadcasting, WWNO, and WRKF. You can find us in your podcast feeds every Friday. Look us up and be sure to subscribe. Thanks for listening, and don't forget to stir your room.